Sometimes the strongest storms do not destroy your life. They introduce you to the person who teaches you how to breathe again. Until that rainy Tuesday afternoon, I would have laughed at anyone who believed a sentence like that. My life had always been measured by deadlines, conference calls, overflowing calendars, and impossible expectations that somehow became even more impossible every passing month. As a senior project manager for a Boston architecture firm, I had convinced myself that success demanded constant motion. Every morning began before sunrise with coffee that never tasted quite right because I drank it too quickly, emails that multiplied faster than I could answer them, and meetings where everyone expected certainty from someone who secretly felt exhausted. I had become so accustomed to carrying pressure that I no longer noticed its weight. My coworkers called me dependable. Clients described me as relentless. Friends joked that I probably scheduled my weekends months in advance. None of them were wrong. They simply did not realize that beneath every carefully organized plan was someone terrified of slowing down long enough to admit she was no longer happy. That afternoon, the final presentation collapsed in spectacular fashion when unexpected budget changes forced our entire project back to the drawing board. I remained calm inside the conference room because that was what professionals were expected to do, but the moment I stepped outside the office building, every carefully controlled emotion rushed forward at once. Dark clouds covered the Boston skyline as cold rain began falling without warning. People hurried toward parking garages and subway entrances while umbrellas opened in every direction. I barely noticed any of them. My thoughts were louder than the storm itself. I walked several blocks without choosing a destination until I finally stopped beside a quiet neighborhood bookstore with an old green awning extending over the sidewalk. Rain soaked my blazer as I stared through the window at shelves filled with novels, warm lights, and people who somehow looked completely untouched by the chaos outside. Then a calm voice spoke beside me. "You are getting completely drenched, and I do not think standing in the rain is solving whatever happened." I turned and found myself looking into the kindest blue eyes I had ever seen. The young woman beside me held a large umbrella over both of us, without hesitation, as though sharing shelter with a stranger required no explanation at all. She wore a cream-colored coat, simple jeans, and comfortable boots that were already dotted with rainwater. Loose blonde hair framed a face that carried the kind of peaceful confidence I had almost forgotten existed. "I am sorry," I said awkwardly. "I did not even notice the rain anymore." She smiled gently. "That usually means something much heavier is happening inside your head." Her words should have felt intrusive, yet somehow they sounded comforting instead. I laughed quietly for the first time all day. "Is it that obvious?" "Only because I have looked exactly like that before," she replied. We stood together beneath the umbrella while traffic rolled past on the wet street, neither of us feeling any urgency to leave. After a comfortable silence, she extended her hand with a warm smile. "I am Claire." I accepted her hand almost automatically.
Harper.
She glanced toward the bookstore entrance before looking back at me. "Would you like to step inside? They have wonderful coffee, and it is much easier to untangle difficult days somewhere warm." I looked at the rain, then at the stranger whose calm presence had already slowed the racing thoughts I had been carrying for months. For reasons I could not explain, saying yes felt easier than holding on to the storm any longer. The warmth inside the bookstore felt almost unreal after the cold rain outside. Soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers while rows of wooden shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with novels whose worn covers suggested they had already changed countless lives. The small cafe tucked into the back corner carried the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee and cinnamon pastries, creating the kind of quiet atmosphere where people naturally lowered their voices without realizing it. Claire greeted the elderly barista by name before turning toward me with an easy smile. "I come here almost every week," she said. "It reminds me that the world usually moves slower than we think it does." I smiled politely, though the idea felt almost impossible. My life had never moved slowly. Even now, my phone vibrated repeatedly inside my coat pocket with emails, missed calls, and urgent notifications demanding immediate attention. I glanced toward the screen before quickly turning it face down on the table. Claire noticed, but said nothing. Instead, she ordered 2 cups of coffee and returned carrying them with effortless calm. "You guessed what I drink?" I asked with quiet amusement. "Not exactly," she admitted. "I just ordered my favorite. If you hate it, I will happily drink both." I laughed again, surprising myself. It was a genuine laugh, not the polite one I usually offer during business dinners or networking events. We spent the next hour talking about ordinary things that somehow felt extraordinary because no one had asked me those questions in years. Claire asked what kind of books I enjoyed when I was younger, what city I would visit if work disappeared for a month, and what I wanted my life to look like 10 years from now. Each question seemed simple, yet every answer forced me to realize how completely my career had replaced the dreams I once carried. When she finally asked what I actually did for a living, I described the architecture firm, the demanding clients, and the endless pursuit of perfection. Claire listened carefully before gently asking, "Do you still enjoy it?" The question lingered between us. I opened my mouth to answer immediately, but nothing came. After several quiet seconds, I looked down at the steam rising from my coffee and admitted something I had never spoken aloud. "I honestly do not know anymore." Claire nodded without surprise. Sometimes we become so good at surviving our routines that we forget to ask whether they still fit the people we have become. Her words settled somewhere deep inside me because they sounded painfully true. Outside, the rain gradually faded until sunlight began breaking through the clouds, filling the bookstore windows with warm afternoon light. I glanced at the clock and realized nearly 2 hours had disappeared without either of us noticing. "I should probably get back," I said reluctantly. Claire smiled. "Probably." Neither of us stood immediately. Finally, as we walked toward the front door together, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small bookmark decorated with watercolor waves and a handwritten quote about finding peace in unexpected places. "They give these away here," she explained. "Take it. Maybe it will remind you that difficult days eventually end." I accepted it with a quiet thank you before stepping back onto the sidewalk where the city looked completely different beneath clear skies. We exchanged one final smile before walking in opposite directions. During the subway ride home, I reached into my pocket several times without realizing it, touching the small bookmark as though it somehow carried the calm I had borrowed that afternoon. By the time I reached my apartment, I had convinced myself that chance encounters belonged exactly where they happened, in a single beautiful afternoon that life would never repeat. The following morning, however, as I entered the lobby of a downtown community arts center for a client meeting, I stopped in complete disbelief because standing near the reception desk, arranging brochures with the same peaceful smile, was Claire. For several long seconds, I simply stood in the lobby wondering whether I had imagined the entire afternoon at the bookstore. Claire looked up from arranging brochures and immediately recognized me, her bright blue eyes widening with the same surprised expression that I knew had appeared on my own face. Then she smiled, calm and genuine, as though unexpected coincidences were perfectly ordinary. "I was beginning to think the rain only introduced people once," she said with quiet humor. I laughed softly as I walked toward the reception desk. "Apparently Boston has other plans." She explained that she worked as the community engagement coordinator for the Arts Center, organizing educational programs, neighborhood events, and partnerships with local organizations. Before I could ask another question, my client arrived and introduced himself as the executive director overseeing the center's upcoming expansion project. The architecture firm I represented had been invited to present renovation concepts for transforming part of the building into a larger cultural space for public workshops and exhibitions. Suddenly, the coincidence became something much more significant. Claire would be part of every planning meeting. During the presentation, I found myself speaking with my usual confidence about design efficiency, construction schedules, and structural improvements, yet every few minutes I noticed Claire quietly listening from the opposite side of the conference table. While everyone else focused on numbers, timelines, and technical drawings, she asked different kinds of questions. She wanted to know how the redesigned space would make children feel during creative workshops, whether elderly visitors could move comfortably through every room, and how natural light might encourage people to spend more time reading or creating art. They were questions no one else had considered, and surprisingly, they became the ones that mattered most. By the end of the meeting, the executive director smiled broadly. "This is exactly why community projects succeed," he said. "One group understands buildings. The other understands people." As everyone gathered their papers, Claire walked beside me toward the lobby. "You looked much less overwhelmed today," she observed. I smiled thoughtfully. "Maybe because I remembered to breathe." She laughed quietly. "That is usually a good place to start." Over the following weeks, our paths crossed repeatedly as the renovation project moved forward. Some meetings lasted only 30 minutes, while others stretched across entire afternoons filled with planning sessions, neighborhood consultations, and visits throughout the building. Gradually, professional conversations transformed into something more personal. We discovered a shared love for independent bookstores, coastal road trips through New England, old jazz records, and quiet mornings before the rest of the world became busy. Claire seemed to notice details everyone else overlooked. She remembered the names of volunteers after meeting them only once, noticed when someone seemed unusually quiet, and always found time to ask sincere questions instead of rushing toward the next task. I admired that about her more than I wanted to admit. One evening, after another successful planning session, we walked outside together beneath a sky painted with soft shades of orange and pink. The city traffic hummed peacefully in the distance, while cool autumn air carried the scent of nearby trees beginning to change color. Claire stopped near the entrance steps and looked toward the setting sun before speaking. "Do you know what I like most about community projects?" I shook my head. They remind people that beautiful spaces are not built only with concrete and steel. They are built because someone believes people deserve a place where they can belong. Her words stayed with me long after we said goodbye. Driving home that evening, I realized something quietly unsettling. For the first time in years, I had spent an entire day thinking less about deadlines than about one conversation, one smile, and one woman whose peaceful presence somehow made every burden I carried feel a little lighter. What frightened me most was not how often Claire appeared in my thoughts. It was how quickly I had begun hoping tomorrow would give me another reason to see her again. Over the next several weeks, the renovation project became the one appointment on my calendar that I never wanted to rush through. Every planning session offered another opportunity to work beside Claire, and without realizing it, I had begun measuring my weeks by the moments we spent together instead of the deadlines waiting back at my office. My coworkers noticed the difference before I did. They commented that I seemed less impatient during meetings, that I listened more carefully, and that I no longer treated every conversation like a race against the clock. I smiled politely whenever someone mentioned it, never admitting that the change had very little to do with me. It had everything to do with the woman who somehow made slowing down feel natural instead of frightening. One Friday afternoon, however, the fragile balance I had been building collapsed almost instantly. A major client unexpectedly rejected months of architectural revisions, forcing our entire design team into an emergency meeting that lasted nearly 4 exhausting hours. By the time I finally left the office, I felt the familiar pressure tightening across my chest once again. My phone continued ringing as I hurried toward my car, each new notification adding another impossible problem demanding immediate attention. Without thinking, I answered a call from one of the project consultants while crossing the parking lot, trying to solve 3 different issues at the same time. My frustration finally overflowed. I spoke more sharply than I intended, ending the conversation with a sigh that echoed across the nearly empty garage. The moment I looked up, I froze. Claire stood only a few feet away beside her car, holding several folders from another community planning meeting scheduled in the same building. She had clearly witnessed enough to understand exactly how overwhelmed I had become. Instead of looking uncomfortable or disappointed, she simply walked over with the same quiet composure she always carried. "You look exhausted," she said gently. I forced a tired smile. That is a polite way of describing it. She glanced toward the gray evening sky before asking a question that caught me completely off guard. "Would you mind taking a short walk before you drive home?" Every practical instinct inside me wanted to refuse. My inbox was overflowing, dinner was still hours away, and tomorrow promised another full schedule. Yet something about Claire's calm voice made saying no feel impossible. We drove separately to a nearby riverside park where autumn leaves floated gently across the Charles River beneath fading sunlight. For several minutes we walked without speaking. The silence felt strangely comforting instead of awkward. Finally, I stopped beside the railing overlooking the water and let out a long breath. I hate feeling like this, I admitted quietly. Every time I think I am finally getting ahead, something else falls apart. Claire rested her hands lightly against the wooden railing, watching the slow current move beneath us. "Do you know what storms and rivers have in common?" she asked. I looked at her curiously. "No," she smiled softly. "Neither one stays exactly the same for very long. They keep moving whether we fight them or not." I laughed quietly. "You always have an answer, do not you?" She shook her head. "Not an answer, just a reminder." We stood there until the last traces of daylight disappeared behind the Boston skyline. For the first time in what felt like years, I allowed myself to stop checking my phone, stop solving problems, and simply exist beside someone who never expected perfection from me. As we turned back toward the parking lot, our shoulders brushed for only a brief moment. Neither of us stepped away immediately. The contact lasted only seconds, but something inside me shifted with unmistakable clarity. Claire was no longer simply the calm presence that helped me survive difficult days. She was quietly becoming the place where I felt most like myself, and that realization frightened me far more than any deadline ever had. The river walk became a quiet turning point that neither Claire nor I acknowledged aloud, yet both of us seemed to feel its effect in the days that followed. Our conversations grew longer, our laughter came more easily, and the moments between meetings no longer felt like brief interruptions in busy schedules. Instead, they became the parts of each day I anticipated most. The renovation project continued moving forward successfully, and every new challenge somehow brought us together instead of pushing us apart. One crisp Saturday morning, Claire invited me to join a group of volunteers organizing a neighborhood reading event for local families at a small community park overlooking Boston Harbor. Normally, I would have spent a weekend catching up on work, but for reasons I no longer questioned, I accepted without hesitation. The park buzzed with quiet energy as children searched through colorful stacks of donated books while parents gathered beneath white tents, sipping hot coffee. Claire moved naturally through the crowd, greeting every volunteer by name, kneeling to recommend stories to excited children, and making each person she spoke with feel as though they were the most important part of the day. Watching her from across the park, I realized kindness could be just as impressive as confidence. After the event ended, we packed the remaining books into storage boxes before wandering toward a small cafe overlooking the harbor. Fishing boats drifted slowly across calm blue water while gulls circled overhead beneath a cloudless autumn sky. We ordered sandwiches and coffee before finding a quiet table near the window where sunlight reflected gently across the bay. Conversation drifted effortlessly from favorite novels to childhood memories. Claire told me about growing up in a small coastal town in Maine where evenings often ended with her family watching sunsets from the shoreline. I shared stories about learning architecture from my grandfather, who believed every building should make people feel welcome long before they noticed its design. "Maybe that is why you care so much about community spaces," Claire said with a thoughtful smile. "You build places where people belong, even if you sometimes forget you deserve that feeling too." Her words settled quietly inside me. I looked out toward the water before asking something I had wondered since the day we met. "How do you stay so calm all the time?" Claire laughed softly. "I do not." I looked back at her, surprised. She continued with quiet honesty. "People only see the moments after I choose peace. They usually do not see the moments before that choice." For the first time, I realized Claire was not naturally fearless. She simply practiced courage differently than I did. As the afternoon faded into early evening, we walked along the harbor promenade where musicians performed gentle acoustic songs and families strolled beneath rows of glowing string lights. Without planning it, our pace slowed until we were walking side by side in comfortable silence. At one point, Claire stopped beside a bench facing the water and quietly handed me a smooth gray stone she had picked up earlier near the shoreline. "My grandmother always carried one like this," she explained. Whenever life became overwhelming, she held it for a moment to remind herself that storms eventually shape even the roughest edges into something beautiful. I turned the small stone over in my hand, smiling as I slipped it into my coat pocket beside the watercolor bookmark she had given me weeks earlier. Somehow, without realizing it, I had begun collecting small pieces of Claire's way of seeing the world. Driving home beneath the first stars of the evening, I understood that the calm she carried was slowly becoming part of me as well. What I did not yet understand was how much harder it would become to imagine a future where she was no longer standing beside me. As October slowly gave way to November, the renovation project entered its busiest stage, bringing longer meetings, tighter deadlines, and countless decisions that affected every part of the community center's future. My schedule quickly returned to the exhausting pace I had once accepted without question, yet something inside me had changed. No matter how demanding my days became, I always found myself looking forward to the moments when Claire walked into a meeting carrying her notebook and that familiar expression of quiet confidence. Somehow, simply knowing she would be there made every challenge seem manageable. One evening, after another 12-hour workday, I remained alone in my office reviewing revised construction estimates while the city lights shimmered beyond the windows. My phone buzzed softly with a message from Claire. "Have you eaten dinner yet?" I looked at the clock and realized it was nearly 9 o'clock. I smiled to myself before answering honestly. Not yet. Less than 15 minutes later, another message appeared.
Come downstairs.
Curious, I took the elevator to the lobby where Claire stood waiting beside the entrance holding 2 paper bags from a small family-owned Italian cafe only a few blocks away. "You looked like someone who might forget to take care of herself," she said with a gentle smile. We carried our dinner to the rooftop terrace of the office building where the Boston skyline stretched across the horizon beneath a clear night sky filled with scattered stars. The cool air carried just enough autumn chill to make the warm food and quiet company feel even more comforting. For a while we talked about ordinary things, the progress of the renovation, funny moments from recent volunteer events, and the books we hoped to read once life became less hectic. Eventually, the conversation drifted into silence as we watched the lights reflected across the Charles River. "Can I ask you something?" Claire said softly. I nodded. "When was the last time you took an entire day off without feeling guilty?" I laughed quietly because I already knew the answer. "I honestly cannot remember." Claire looked toward the skyline before speaking again. "Harper, I admire how hard you work, but sometimes it feels like you believe your value depends on how much you accomplish." Her words landed with surprising force because they echoed thoughts I had never admitted, even to myself. After a long pause, I whispered, "Maybe it does." Claire turned toward me immediately, her expression filled not with judgment, but with genuine concern. "No," she said gently. "Your work is something you do. It has never been who you are." I looked away, struggling to explain feelings I had buried beneath years of ambition. "If I stop moving," I admitted quietly, "I am afraid everything I have built will disappear." Claire smiled with remarkable patience. "The people who truly care about you are not standing beside your achievements. They are standing beside you." Those words remained suspended between us as the city continued glowing beneath the quiet night. Without thinking, I reached into my coat pocket and found the smooth gray stone she had given me weeks earlier. I held it gently in my hand before looking back at her. "You know," I said with a small smile, "I still carry this every day." Claire laughed softly. "I had a feeling you might." We sat together until the rooftop grew colder and the office building around us became almost completely empty. As we finally stood to leave, I realized the greatest change was no longer happening inside my career or my schedule. It was happening inside my heart. For the first time in years, I wanted something more than professional success, and that truth was both the most beautiful and the most frightening realization I had ever faced, because I had quietly fallen in love with the one person who had taught me that even the strongest storms eventually learn how to rest. The days after that quiet evening on the rooftop felt strangely different, not because anything had changed between Claire and me on the surface, but because everything had changed inside my heart. I had finally admitted to myself what I had spent weeks trying to deny. I loved her. The realization should have brought clarity, yet instead it filled me with a new kind of fear. Every smile she offered suddenly carried more meaning. Every conversation became more precious. Every goodbye felt just a little more difficult than the one before. I convinced myself that the safest choice was to create a little distance before my feelings grew beyond my ability to control them. The following week, I accepted several additional projects at the architecture firm, volunteered to attend meetings that another manager could easily have handled, and buried myself beneath schedules so crowded that I barely had time to think. When Claire suggested lunch after one planning session, I apologized and blamed work. When she invited me to visit a small holiday market opening downtown, I claimed I had another commitment. None of the excuses were entirely false, but none of them revealed the real reason either. Every time I walked away, it felt as though I was leaving something far more important than another conversation behind. Claire never argued or questioned my decisions. She simply smiled with quiet understanding, wished me a good evening, and allowed me the space I believed I needed. Her kindness somehow made the distance hurt even more. Nearly 2 weeks passed before the renovation committee gathered again inside the Community Arts Center to review the final design approvals. Throughout the meeting, I remained focused on architectural plans, budgets, and construction schedules, avoiding unnecessary eye contact whenever Claire spoke. I told myself I was behaving professionally, but deep inside I knew I was simply hiding. After the meeting ended, volunteers and committee members gradually filtered toward the exits until only Claire and I remained inside the nearly empty gallery. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long golden reflections across the polished wooden floor. Claire quietly gathered several folders before walking toward me. "Have I done something wrong?" she asked gently. The question caught me completely unprepared. "No," I answered immediately. "Then why does it feel like you keep disappearing every time we start getting closer?" she asked with remarkable calm. I searched for an explanation that would not reveal too much, but every carefully prepared excuse suddenly sounded meaningless. Claire looked at me with the same peaceful expression she had worn since the rainy afternoon outside the bookstore. "Harper," she said softly, "being calm does not mean I never notice when someone is hurting." Her words broke through every defense I had built. I looked toward the empty chairs surrounding the meeting tables before quietly admitting, "I am trying to protect you." She tilted her head slightly. "From what?" I took a long breath, finally allowing the truth to surface. "From me. From my endless stress, my impossible expectations, my habit of turning every challenge into another storm. You deserve someone whose life is already peaceful." Claire stepped a little closer, her voice no louder than a whisper. "Harper, peace has never meant living without storms." She smiled gently, her eyes filled with quiet certainty. "Peace means choosing not to leave when the storm arrives." The room became completely silent. For the first time since we met, I realized Claire had never been waiting for me to become someone different. She had simply been waiting for me to believe that I was already worthy of staying beside her. Standing there beneath the warm afternoon light, I understood that running away had never protected either of us. It had only delayed the moment when I would finally have to decide whether fear or love deserved to shape the rest of my life. Claire's words followed me everywhere after that afternoon in the empty gallery. I heard them while reviewing blueprints, sitting through client meetings, and driving home beneath streets glowing with early holiday lights. Peace means choosing not to leave when the storm arrives. I wanted to believe her. More than that, I wanted to become the person who deserved such unwavering faith. Yet life had its own plans. 2 days later, our architecture firm received unexpected news that threatened the entire community center renovation. Rising construction costs and funding reductions forced the executive board to reconsider several major portions of the project. Emergency meetings filled the following week as every department searched for ways to preserve the vision without exceeding the revised budget. The pressure returned with overwhelming force. I watched months of careful planning begin slipping away, one difficult decision at a time. Every compromise felt personal because I knew how much this project meant to the families who would eventually use the space and to Claire, who had poured her heart into making every room welcoming for the community. The stress I thought I had finally learned to manage quickly found its way back into every corner of my life. I stopped sleeping well. Meals became quick afterthoughts between conference calls. My patience disappeared once again beneath endless calculations and impossible expectations. One evening, after a particularly discouraging meeting, I sat alone in my office staring at revised budget reports that seemed determined to erase everything we had worked so hard to create. Claire called just as I closed another spreadsheet. I looked at her name glowing across my phone and hesitated before answering. The warmth in her voice was immediate. "I was thinking about you," she said gently. "How are you holding up?" I wanted to tell her the truth. I wanted to admit that I felt like I was failing everyone involved. Instead, the exhaustion inside me spoke first. "I cannot do this tonight, Claire." Silence filled the line for only a moment before she answered softly. "All right. I just wanted to make sure you were not carrying everything alone." I ended the call politely, but the conversation left a heaviness that stayed with me long afterward. The next morning I arrived at the Community Arts Center before sunrise to review construction documents before another planning session. The building was completely quiet except for the sound of footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. As I entered the future reading room, I found Claire already there, arranging community artwork that would eventually decorate the finished space. She looked up with a gentle smile that never blamed me for the distance I had created. "I thought you might come early," she said. I sighed quietly, setting my briefcase on a nearby table. "Everything feels like it is falling apart." Claire walked slowly toward one of the large windows overlooking the neighborhood outside. Children waited at a nearby school bus stop while parents waved goodbye before beginning another ordinary day. "Look out there," she whispered. "The building is not finished yet, but those families already believe it will matter." Hope often arrives long before the final result. I shook my head. Hope does not solve budget problems.
Claire nodded calmly. "No."
But hopelessness does not solve them either. Her quiet certainty should have comforted me, yet frustration had already begun building beyond my ability to contain it. I looked away from the window and spoke more sharply than I intended. "You always make everything sound simple." The moment the words left my mouth, regret followed immediately. Claire did not argue or raise her voice. She simply looked at me with gentle sadness before replying, "No, Harper. I simply believe difficult things become easier when people stop facing them alone." She quietly gathered the artwork she had been organizing and walked toward the doorway, leaving me standing alone in the unfinished room. Watching her disappear down the hallway, I realized that in trying to protect the person I loved from my storm, I had become the storm itself. After Claire quietly walked away from the unfinished reading room, the silence she left behind felt louder than every construction crew, budget meeting, and ringing phone that had consumed my life for months. I remained standing beside the tall windows long after she disappeared, staring at the neighborhood outside while replaying my own words again and again. They had not been cruel, but they had carried the weight of exhaustion instead of honesty. Claire had never asked me to solve every problem alone. She had only asked me to let someone stand beside me while I tried. Yet I had answered her kindness with distance once again. The following days became strangely empty. Our renovation meetings continued as scheduled, but Claire limited every conversation to project updates, volunteer schedules, and community feedback. She remained professional, warm, and respectful, yet the effortless laughter we had once shared quietly disappeared. I noticed the absence in every room we entered together. Even the volunteers who knew us only through the project seemed to sense that something had changed. I buried myself even deeper in work, convincing myself that finishing the project mattered more than repairing my own mistakes. Then, late one Friday afternoon, the executive director called an emergency meeting with encouraging news. After weeks of negotiations, a local charitable foundation had agreed to provide additional funding that would allow the community center to preserve nearly every feature originally planned. The room erupted in relieved applause as architects, volunteers, and board members celebrated together. Everyone smiled except me. The project had finally been saved, yet the one relationship I valued most felt farther away than ever. As people slowly left the conference room, I searched for Claire but discovered she had already gone home. Without giving myself another opportunity to overthink, I left the building and drove toward the quiet bookstore where we had first met on that rainy afternoon months earlier. The familiar green awning still stretched above the sidewalk while warm light spilled onto the street through the front windows. Claire sat alone near the same corner table where we had once shared coffee, with two strangers' curiosity. She looked up as I entered, surprised but not uncomfortable. I carried 2 cups of coffee to her table before sitting across from her, without speaking immediately. For several moments, we simply listened to the soft jazz playing in the background. Finally, I looked at her and spoke with complete honesty. I spent so much time believing I had to carry every storm by myself that I forgot storms are not dangerous because they exist. They become dangerous when they convince us to push away the people willing to stay. Claire quietly listened without interrupting. I reached into my coat pocket and placed the small gray stone beside the watercolor bookmark she had given me during our very first meeting. I have carried both of these every single day, I admitted. Not because they solve problems, but because they remind me of the person who has quietly changed the way I see the world. Claire's eyes softened, though she remained silent. I continued before fear could stop me. You once told me peace means choosing not to leave when the storm arrives. The truth is, I kept believing you deserved clear skies instead of someone like me. I was wrong. You never asked me to become perfect. You only asked me to stop facing everything alone. Claire smiled gently, her eyes shining with quiet emotion. And have you finally learned that lesson? She asked softly. I nodded without hesitation. I think I am finally ready to. She reached across the small wooden table and rested her hand lightly over mine. The gesture was simple, quiet, and completely natural. No dramatic promises filled the room. No grand speeches followed. In that peaceful bookstore where everything had begun, one small act of understanding became more powerful than every fear I had carried, and for the first time in my life, I realized that choosing love was not surrendering to the storm. It was finally choosing the person who had never stopped waiting on the other side of it. Leaving the bookstore that evening felt entirely different from the first time Claire and I had stepped into the rain together months earlier. Then, I had walked away carrying questions about a stranger whose quiet kindness seemed almost impossible to understand. Now I walked beside the woman I loved, no longer afraid to admit that my future looked brighter whenever she was part of it. We moved slowly through the cool Boston evening beneath rows of glowing streetlights while the city settled into its familiar rhythm. Around us, neither of us felt any urgency to fill the silence because it finally carried comfort instead of uncertainty. Claire smiled as we reached the corner where our cars were parked. You seem lighter, she said softly. I looked at her before answering with complete honesty. That is probably because I finally stopped pretending I had to carry everything by myself. She nodded gently. It suits you. Over the following weeks, life did not suddenly become easier. The renovation project still demanded careful decisions, unexpected revisions, and long hours of collaboration. My inbox remained full, meetings still stretched across entire afternoons, and deadlines continued arriving faster than anyone wanted. The difference was no longer found in my schedule.
It was found in the way I faced each day.
Instead of isolating myself whenever pressure increased, I allowed Claire to become part of the difficult moments as naturally as she had always been part of the peaceful ones. Some evenings, we reviewed community feedback together over dinner at the small Italian cafe near my office. Other nights, we simply walked beside the Charles River, without discussing work at all. Gradually, I discovered something remarkable. Sharing burdens did not make me weaker. It gave me the strength to carry them with greater clarity than ever before. One quiet Sunday afternoon, after volunteering together at the Community Arts Center, Claire invited me to visit a scenic overlook outside the city where she often went whenever life felt especially meaningful. The drive took less than an hour, winding through quiet New England roads lined with bare autumn trees waiting for winter. We reached a peaceful hill overlooking a wide lake where gentle waves reflected the golden colors of the late afternoon sky. A wooden bench faced the water, surrounded by tall grass moving softly in the cool breeze. We sat together watching a family of ducks glide peacefully across the surface, while distant church bells echoed from a nearby town. After several quiet minutes, I finally spoke about something I had avoided for years. When I was younger, I admitted, my father believed success meant never showing weakness. If something frightened me, I worked harder. If something hurt, I stayed busy. I thought achievement would eventually make fear disappear. Claire listened carefully, without interrupting. "Did it?" she asked gently. I smiled sadly.
No.
"It only made me better at hiding it." Claire reached for my hand and held it with quiet reassurance. "You know what I see when I look at you?" she asked. I shook my head. "I see someone brave enough to unlearn everything that convinced her she had to earn love instead of simply receiving it." Her words settled deep inside me because they described the truth more clearly than I ever could. I looked across the peaceful lake before continuing. "I spent so many years believing I had to become perfect before I deserved someone like you." Claire smiled warmly and squeezed my hand a little tighter. "Harper, love has never been a reward for perfection. It has always been a place where imperfect people choose each other anyway." As the sun slowly disappeared behind the hills, painting the sky with soft shades of gold and crimson, I realized I was no longer afraid of the future. Challenges would still come. Unexpected storms would still arrive. But for the first time in my life, I understood that I did not have to face any of them alone because the greatest change had never been finding someone capable of calming my storms. It had been learning to believe I was finally worthy of standing beside the person who never stopped believing in me. Winter arrived quietly, wrapping Boston in crisp mornings, glowing storefront windows, and the first light dusting of snow that settled across rooftops without interrupting the city's steady rhythm. The Community Arts Center renovation entered its final stage, transforming months of drawings, meetings, and shared determination into something tangible. Every visit to the building revealed another finished room, another freshly painted wall, another space beginning to resemble the place everyone had imagined from the very beginning. Walking through the nearly completed center beside Claire no longer felt like inspecting a construction project. It felt like watching hope take shape one room at a
Time.
Our relationship settled into a comfortable rhythm that neither of us tried to define with grand declarations. We simply chose each other every day. Some mornings Claire brought coffee to my office before her own meetings began. Other evenings I met her after volunteer programs ended, and we walked through downtown Boston beneath holiday lights while talking about everything from favorite childhood traditions to the books waiting on our nightstands. The extraordinary moments were beautiful, but it was the ordinary ones that quietly became unforgettable. One Monday afternoon, however, another unexpected challenge tested everything I had been learning. During a final inspection, city officials discovered that updated accessibility regulations required several last-minute modifications before the building could officially open. The changes were completely reasonable, but they threatened to delay the grand opening that hundreds of volunteers, donors, and neighborhood families had anticipated for months. I felt the familiar wave of pressure rising almost immediately. My instinct urged me to solve every problem alone before disappointing anyone. I looked around the conference room and noticed everyone waiting for answers. A few months earlier, I would have accepted every responsibility without hesitation, convinced that carrying the entire burden alone proved my commitment. Instead, I paused. I looked toward Claire, who stood quietly across the room meeting my eyes with calm encouragement rather than expectation. For the first time, I chose something different. "We're going to solve this together," I said, addressing the entire team. No single person built this project, and no single person needs to carry this challenge. The atmosphere in the room shifted almost immediately. Architects suggested practical design adjustments. Volunteers reorganized event schedules. Community leaders contacted local suppliers willing to accelerate deliveries. Claire coordinated communication with neighborhood organizations so everyone understood the revised timeline without losing enthusiasm. Watching dozens of people willingly support one another reminded me that trust often creates solutions that individual effort never could. Over the next several days, we worked side by side, sharing long hours without allowing stress to replace kindness. Whenever I became overwhelmed, Claire simply rested a reassuring hand on my shoulder or reminded me to take a short break. I no longer viewed those small gestures as interruptions. They had become part of how I worked, how I lived, and how I loved. Late one evening, after the final accessibility adjustments had been approved, we stood alone inside the completed reading room where our most difficult conversation had once taken place. Warm lights illuminated rows of bookshelves waiting to welcome children and families for the first time. I smiled as I looked around the peaceful space. "Do you remember the last time we stood here?" I asked quietly. Claire laughed softly. "You believed you had become the storm." I nodded. "Now I understand something different." She tilted her head with gentle curiosity. "What is that?" I looked at her with complete certainty before answering. "Storms are temporary. The people who stay beside you through them are the ones who become home." Claire's eyes filled with quiet emotion as she smiled, and in that finished room built through patience, trust, and countless shared moments, I realized the strongest foundation we had created was never made of brick, glass, or steel. It was the life we had slowly learned to build together. The morning of the grand opening arrived beneath a brilliant winter sky, with sunlight reflecting across fresh snow and filling the streets of Boston with a quiet sense of celebration. Families began gathering outside the community arts center long before the doors officially opened. Children bounced with excitement while volunteers welcomed neighbors carrying homemade cookies, warm coffee, and handmade decorations that reflected the spirit of the community everyone had worked so hard to support. Standing near the entrance beside Claire, I watched people smile as they admired the finished building, and for the first time since the project had begun, I allowed myself to enjoy the moment instead of searching for the next problem waiting to be
solved.
The executive director stepped onto the small stage prepared for the opening ceremony and thanked every architect, volunteer, donor, teacher, and community member whose dedication had transformed an ambitious idea into reality. As applause echoed throughout the gathering, he unexpectedly invited Claire and me to stand beside him. These two women reminded all of us that great buildings are never created by blueprints alone, he said warmly. They are created by people who believe every person deserves a place where they belong. I glanced toward Claire, whose smile carried the same peaceful confidence I had admired since the rainy afternoon we first met. Months earlier, I would have felt uncomfortable standing in front of a crowd receiving recognition. Today, I simply felt grateful. After the ceremony ended, families explored every room of the newly completed center. Children settled into colorful reading corners with stacks of books, artists prepared workshops inside bright studio spaces, and elderly neighbors gathered around large community tables sharing stories with people they had only just met. Every room felt alive with laughter, conversation, and possibility. Claire and I quietly wandered through the building together, occasionally stopping to greet volunteers or answer questions about the renovation. Eventually, we reached the reading room where our journey had nearly fallen apart before finding its way forward again. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows exactly as it had during our difficult conversation months before, but everything else felt different. Shelves were now filled with books, comfortable chairs invited quiet reflection, and children happily turned pages together in peaceful silence. Claire looked around the room with quiet satisfaction. "This is exactly how I imagined it," she whispered. I smiled gently. "It is even better." She turned toward me with curious eyes.
Why?
I looked around at the families filling every corner with warmth and life before answering. Because I used to believe success meant finishing a project. Now I understand. It means creating something that continues helping people long after we leave. Claire reached for my hand, and I held it without hesitation. There was no fear left in the simple gesture.
No uncertainty.
Only gratitude for every difficult conversation, every unexpected setback, and every ordinary moment that had quietly shaped us into the people standing there together. As evening approached and the last visitors slowly made their way home, we stepped outside beneath a sky painted with soft shades of pink and gold. Snowflakes began drifting gently through the fading light, settling across the quiet streets, while the windows of the community arts center glowed warmly behind us. I reached into my coat pocket and smiled as my fingers found the smooth gray stone and the watercolor bookmark that had remained with me from the very beginning. I realized I no longer carried them because I needed reminders to keep moving forward. I carried them because they reminded me where the most meaningful journey of my life had truly begun. Looking at Claire beside me, I understood that peace had never been the absence of storms. Peace had always been finding the courage to walk through them together, one quiet day at a time, until love finally felt as natural as coming home. 1 year passed more quickly than either of us expected. Seasons quietly completed their familiar cycle. The community art center became one of the busiest gathering places in the neighborhood, and the life Claire and I had built together settled into something beautifully ordinary. Every Saturday morning, children filled the reading room with laughter while artists taught painting classes, musicians performed free concerts, and neighbors who had once been strangers now greeted one another like lifelong friends. Watching the building come alive never grew old because every smile reminded me that hope could become something real when enough people believed in it together. My own life had changed in ways I could never have imagined during that rainy afternoon when I first stood outside the bookstore believing that constant pressure was simply the price of success. I still loved architecture. I still cared deeply about every project entrusted to me. The difference was that my career no longer defined my worth. I learned to leave work at the office more often, to enjoy quiet dinners without checking emails every few minutes, and to spend entire weekends exploring bookstores, coastal towns, and walking trails with Claire instead of carrying another stack of unfinished reports home. She never demanded those changes from me. She simply created a life that reminded me why they mattered. One peaceful spring afternoon, we returned to the small riverside park where months earlier I had confessed how frightened I was of slowing down. Cherry trees now stretched above the walking paths, their blossoms drifting gently across the water while families enjoyed warm sunshine and children laughed from a nearby playground. We found the same wooden railing where Claire had once told me that storms and rivers never stayed the same forever. Standing there again, I realized how completely those simple words had changed my life. Claire rested beside me, watching sailboats move quietly across the Charles River. "You have been smiling all afternoon," she said with a playful laugh. "What are you thinking about?" I looked across the calm water before answering. I was remembering the woman who offered half of her umbrella to a stranger who looked completely lost. Claire smiled warmly. I remember wondering whether she would ever slow down long enough to notice the sunshine after the rain. I laughed softly. She eventually figured it out. Claire slipped her hand into mine as naturally as breathing. She did. We remained there for several peaceful moments, saying nothing because nothing more needed to be said. The river continued flowing just as it had on the day we first walked beside it, yet everything inside me had changed. I reached into my jacket pocket and smiled as my fingers touched the smooth gray stone and the faded watercolor bookmark that I still carried every day. They had become quiet reminders not of where my story began, but of the person I chose to become. Looking at Claire, I understood something that had taken me an entire lifetime to learn. Love does not arrive to erase every storm. It arrives to remind us that even on the hardest days, someone is willing to stand beside us until the clouds finally pass. I once believed strength meant facing every challenge alone. Now I knew real strength meant trusting another heart enough to let it share the weight. As we turned away from the river and began the familiar walk home together beneath the warm afternoon sun, I realized the greatest lesson of my life had never been about architecture, achievement, or success. It had been about choosing love over fear, peace over pride, and the extraordinary beauty hidden inside the quiet decision to stay. And in the end, that simple choice became the foundation strong enough to carry every tomorrow we would build together.